Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today with a follow-up video for my 1/6 scale M4A3E2 76 Jumbo Sherman tank. This model here is one of my older builds that has been sitting in the shop for a number of years now. Actually, it's over 10 at this point. As I mentioned in the M4A4 update video that I posted about a year ago, recently I completed a new display area where I can display my large and small scale models. I've recently been going through the procedures of taking the older builds out of storage, cleaning them up, making a few small repairs here or there, and getting them ready for display in their new location. And that's exactly what I did with this one over here. This model here is one of the more interesting and unique pieces that are in my 1/6 scale tank collection. Because of the subject matter itself, a 76mm Jumbo is kind of a niche tank, and it's even a niche amongst the Jumbo, which is kind of an offshoot of the Sherman family as a whole. But also, I believe at the time of filming this video, this may still be one of the few, if not the only, examples of a 76mm Jumbo in 1/6 scale. And another detail that makes this model even more cooler is that this particular build that we see here was the master that was used to create the molds for a 1/6 scale M4A3E2 Jumbo kit that was released in limited numbers about 10 years ago. So this model does have a lot of very cool attributes going towards it, not to mention all the other details and fittings I'm going to be going over in this video. As I mentioned before, this model was built back in 2011. And unlike the other older builds that I've done videos on that are found on this channel, this one here was one of the first where I did a thorough build series like I do today with my contemporary builds, where I start from the project start and bring you, the viewers, along till the model's completion. All of the videos are found on a playlist found on the ECA channel. But one quirk was when I made this video series here, specifically the final video, I was really still learning how to use the video editing software. And the final model showcase video for this build, I had this weird quirk where for some reason the aspect ratio was messed up. And because of that, the video is actually kind of letterboxed. And the video's still up, I'm not going to take it down. However, I felt that now that I was able to take this one out of storage and clean it up a bit, I might as well do a proper model showcase video on it, much along the lines I do on my current builds. And for this build here, I believe it's definitely worth it. So let's go ahead and start this video off. Before I do, however, I do want to mention, of course, that this model is built for my own personal collection. It's not for sale and or purchase. However, like I often mention in these videos, I frequently take on commission build projects from models ranging between 1/35 scale and 1/6 scale. For availability and pricing information, that information would be best by contacting me through the email address listed below, which is info@eastcoastarmory.com. And one other final thing I want to mention is that this model here, being an ECA build, is covered in EastCoastArmory.com components, as well as some other components from other manufacturers from the era. A lot of the components that you see on this model here are no longer offered on the ECA catalog because they have been retired and phased out with modern contemporaries that are made out of 3D print as opposed to metal and cast resin, which are found on this older example here. We'll be going over all of this information on what components are still around and what have been phased out in this video. So there's going to be a bit of content coming right at you. To kickstart this video, let's go ahead and take a quick walk around this model. And this vehicle here is the M4A3E2 76 Jumbo Sherman Assault Tank. The M4A3E2 Sherman is intended for a specialty use, which was to be used as an assault tank. Basically, this vehicle was not meant to tangle with other enemy tanks. It was meant specifically to take out positions in an assault type manner. You have infantry and you have this tank to support the infantry, and this is why this tank needed these modifications, because it was definitely going to be taking enemy rounds. So the tank as a whole was completely redesigned to better prepared for this type of a situation. All of the Jumbo Shermans were utilizing Ford-built late production M4A3 hulls. The hulls were modified though at the factory to have much thicker armor added to the sides, the front glacis plate, and a brand new transmission cover was developed. All of the armor plates were simply just welded over the existing armor plates that were found on the vehicle's hull. For the transmission, however, this utilized an entire new casting in order to facilitate this component. Both of the traditional Sherman transmission covers and the jumbos were made from a single piece of cast steel. However, the difference is with the armor protection. The thickness of the jumbo's front transmission cover was much greater compared to the standard Sherman bow nose transmission cover. Unlike the hull, where the designers just took an existing vehicle and added upon it, the turret was going to be completely different. The turret on the jumbo was a brand new casting, and it was specific for the jumbo. Even though the jumbo turret looks very similar aesthetically to the standard 76mm T23, the two turrets are completely different and are not based off of one another. The big difference separating the two turrets is with the armor protection. The jumbo's turret was much more heavily armored compared to the turret on the standard T23 76. The only thing that the T23 and the jumbo turret have in common is the front trunnion section, because the jumbo was going to utilize the front trunnion and the front mantlet of the standard T23. The difference, however, was the extra modifications done to it. The jumbo's mantlet took the T23 version and added a gigantic slab of steel to the front portion, making it all that much more thicker. And what's even more interesting about this vehicle is that although it utilizes a modified 76mm T23 mantlet and trunnion system, the vehicle was armed from the factory by design with the standard 75. And the reason, again, has to do with the purpose of this vehicle. This vehicle was intended, again, for assaulting purposes. And because of that, the 75 had much greater HE capabilities compared to the 76, which was designed to be a high-velocity, penetrating type platform. Because of all this extra armor, the vehicle was going to be considerably heavier compared to the standard Sherman. And because of this, sinking into the ground was going to be a problem. And this is why all of the jumbos were equipped with the Duckbill Extenders to give the tracks a little bit more surface area so the tank has better performance off-road. After a short developmental period, the vehicles were adopted for service, entered into production, and wound their way into actual theater and combat. The vehicles wound up in the European theater shortly after the Normandy invasion timeframe and were utilized by the US Army all the way up to the end of the war. In theater, the crews absolutely loved this vehicle, and they really appreciated the extra armor protection that was available on this vehicle compared to the other versions of the Sherman. The vehicle's demand outstretched supply so bad that Patton himself, or I believe it was Bradley, one of the generals at the time, put an order out to retrofit as many Shermans as possible to jumbo spec. So this is why you saw a lot of vehicles with chopped up plates from other salvage tanks that were knocked out, or even German tanks are welded over to give them this type of a armor protection feature. What's also interesting is that, of course, right after the vehicles entered into service and were being used in field, the crews and everyone quickly realized how great this thing would be if it had the 76 instead of the 75. A number of these vehicles had this modification made. Basically, whenever a spare 76 would turn up, either from a knocked out vehicle or for one reason or another, they would go ahead and swap it into the jumbo. Again, because the vehicle utilized the mantlet of the T23 turret, swapping out the 75 for the 76 was ridiculously easily done. These vehicles received the moniker M4A3E2 76. In addition to replacing the 76, another modification that was done at the same time was the replacement of the coax M1919 machine gun, replacing it with a Browning M2HB or an AN M250 if one were to become available. Just like with the 76 mounts, because the M2 and the 1919 have such a similar dimension of the receiver, swapping out the two was also relatively easily done. And when done, you now have extra firepower of a 50 cal as a coax as opposed to something in 30. This model here I built back in 2011. However, it actually dates back much earlier than that. If we rewind our clocks back to the early 2000s, the 1/6 scale model market was almost non-existent, and it was really a garage cottage type industry. At this time, one of the people that were really active in the hobby was a guy by the name of James DeSimone. Mr. DeSimone was an avid G.I. Joe collector and is actually one of the more famous collectors out there. At that time, in the late 90s, he actually developed a range of reproduction G.I. Joe scale models, or really more or less toys, but they were something that he offered for the action figure community. Unlike the other companies out there who were manufacturing things, his idea was to take these models and reproduce them in a material called rotomolded plastic. Rotomolded plastic is the type of material that you see large outdoor wagons and children's ride-on toys made from. This material is nice and hollow, it's very durable, and you can manufacture it for a price that's not that expensive. Mr. DeSimone was producing kits in this format for a number of years, but again, they were mostly just toyish type vehicles. It wasn't until 2003 was when he decided to tool up a more to scale range of models that were made out of the same material. He released 3 of them at this time, one of which being a Hetzer, a T-34, and a M4A3 soon followed. All 3 of these models were made out of the rotomold plastic, and what was neat about them was their availability and their cost. These models were extremely affordable, retailing anywhere between $75 for the Hetzer to about $150 for the Sherman. Unfortunately, when these models were released, they were not met with great applause from the 1/6 scale community, and honestly, most individuals tend to turn their noses up at them, specifically the elitists, which seems like every hobby has them. One thing that was bad with the rotomolded models was that the surface detailing was very poor on them. They were great in basically every regard, but their one Achilles heel was the surface detailing. And the James DeSimone models really did suffer from this. However, all of these were something that can be turned around with a little bit of elbow grease, but this was the type of thing that took a special skill set and, more importantly, a ton of extra detail components to accomplish. Back in the 2003 timeframe, all of these components were just not available, or they just didn't exist at that time. So the builder was on the hook for absolutely everything. All the components I'm going to be mentioning in this video, the builder was on the hook to scratch build, so that should put things into perspective. The one thing that I saw on these models was great potential, because although the surface detailing was poor, the one thing that they had was the appropriate size and shape of the vehicle in question. And that is really all you need to have a good foundation to build upon. And this is where I was able to grab one of these models and take it further. The first one I purchased was an M4A3. I built it up, and at the time there was no cast resting components, so I had to basically scratch build everything by hand, which I went ahead and did, and that model turned out way better than I possibly ever imagined. Shortly after I built that model there, I went ahead and picked up a second one, and I built that one into an M4A3 76. Utilizing much along the same scratch building techniques that I utilized on the first build. Why all this pretext is important is because in the year 2004 or so, Mr. DeSimone decided to leave the rotomolded tank business, and he sold the rights to the Sherman to another customizer by the name of Plastic Panzers. Plastic Panzers, like myself, saw the potential in the rotomold models, and he wanted to enhance and add upon the line. At this time, I just completed my M4A3 76, and around October or so of that year, after seeing those images, he contacts me about potentially working together. He came with a proposition for me to design a turret conversion for the James DeSimone Sherman tank, which was also going to be made out of rotomold. Of course, I wasn't going to turn that down, and I went ahead and took on the project. I went ahead and scratch built this turret that we see right here for that kit. The turret was completed in about 2005, so we're talking about winter of 05 or so, and then I sent it off to Plastic Panzers, and I didn't really hear from him for a little bit of time after that. About a year later, he contacted me about doing a conversion for the hull itself so he can offer the Jumbo as a complete kit as opposed to just a turret conversion, to which then I also eagerly agreed to. He sent me a stock James DeSimone Sherman hull, and I went ahead and made the up armor conversion to the way you see it here. This would include, of course, armoring the sides, the front, and also thickening up the bow transmission cover. At that time, I went ahead and sent the tank back into Plastic Panzers, who he got the model, and then after a while he had the necessary funds acquired to go ahead and release this as an actual kit, which he did. The kits were released in about 2009, I want to say, or so, and they were produced primarily out of fiberglass as opposed to rotomold, for one reason or another. After he was done with the molding, he went ahead and sent me the master back for the turret and the hull, because that was basically the agreement. In addition to that, I also got a production sample of one of the kits. After the production and the prototype, or I should say the masters, came back in, I went ahead and decided to build the model up into the configuration that we have here. And the model was started, its construction, in 2011 and finished about 2 or 3 months afterwards. At that time, EastCoastArmory.com was really active in the 1/6 scale field, and I was tooling up, or had a large number of Sherman tank parts tooled up in 1/6 scale, which made the build and completion of this model accelerated to the fact that I was able to get it done in about 3 months' time. After the model was completed, I went ahead, took some photographs of it, made a quick little video, and then from there it went into storage in the rear confine of the shop. Until today, where I went ahead and dusted it off, cleaned it up, and at this point here it's ready to be moved to the new display location. Starting with the model's running gear, the Vvss suspension that you see here is all 100% EastCoastArmory.com, and these are all resin castings. These pieces here are still in production at the time of filming of this video. This is true for not just the Vvss housings themselves, but also with the different types of row wheels that you see on this model. This model here has a mix and match type feature where we have solid late pattern dish, and we also have the later pattern of solid spoke. Of course, the Zerk fittings on all the appropriate locations are painted red, and the units are also fully functional, as you can see. As I touched upon before, the Vvss are still in production and available on the ECA catalog, and are offered in a few different flavors. Basically a mix between the hold variants over here with the wrenchlets and the wrenchlet-less versions of the swing arms. Another difference is with the pattern of the skid rails, which is of course a common detail found on these Shermans. The skid rails on these, or I should say on this older model here, is made from stamped pieces of sheet metal. However, in recent years, these were phased out and replaced with units made from 3D printings. While on the topic of components that are ECA resin castings, we have here the Vvss rear idler wheel. This component here is again a standard catalog item and is still listed on the catalog today. Of course, being a Vvss Sherman, the face portion of the wheel would be steel, and you can see the weathering found on this component in that format. The same is also true for the small overturn rollers, as I often mention in these videos. Vvss Shermans have both of these materials in steel, and they are not rubber rimmed as they are found on the HVSS suspension that came afterwards. And again, yes, these Zerk fittings are painted in red on both of these locations here, as well as also on the appropriate locations found on the return roller. The next aspect of the running gear to talk about are the sprockets, the track, and even the final drives. All three of these components are not EastCoastArmory.com pieces and were acquired from a different aftermarket vendor. The vendor that I used at the time was a vendor known by Panzerwerk, who was out in California, and sadly he is no longer in business and the parts are no longer in production. So basically what you're seeing here is a time capsule of the type of components that were on the market at that time. The Panzerwerk parts were excellent, and they still are excellent even today, all these years later. His components were a mix of plastic as well as also, or mostly cast resin, and he did have some other components in injection molded plastic. The sprockets here are his, and they are excellent. They are cast resin, of course, and have the appropriate size, shape, and detailing for this equipment. The fasteners here are the correct sizes, and they even have the nice little detailing found on the two different patterns, and there are several details on the interior portion of the sprocket, which you will see things like the bulkheads and also the opposite sides of the fasteners. Overall, these sprockets no longer being on the market is something that really does sting. With the camera readjusted, hopefully you get to see the detailing found on the inner portion over here of those details that I was mentioning before. Same is also true for the final drives. The final drives have all of the appropriate fastener and geometry detailing that one would expect, and the rigidity braces are found on the final drive stem, which is a bit of detailing that I personally appreciate, although of course once these sprockets get installed you're not going to see them anymore, but again it's really cool to have nonetheless. Obviously the Panzerwerk sprocket and the Panzerwerk final drive are designed to work together, and so pairing them up on this build here and all the other builds that I've done where I utilize them was something that was really beneficial. As for the track itself, these again are from Panzerwerk, and his tracks were awesome. I really miss these tracks. They were made from injection molded plastic and were similar in design to the Dragon Vvss tracks that came out about a couple years later. Remember, these tracks here date back to about 2007 or 8 or so, and Dragon released their Sherman about, 2011, about around the time this particular kit here or model was built. Anyway, the tracks were made from ABS, injection molded plastic. They assemble in 2 or 3 pieces, where the rubber pad itself was a clamshell type system, where you had 2 hollow sections to put steel pins to connect them and pin them to the teeth. And unlike the Dragon Sherman, which I believe may or may not have done this, the Panzerwerk ones came with the actual Duckbill Extenders. And of course, for a jumbo, the Duckbill Extenders are pretty much mandatory because of the vehicle type. One other thing to mention about the tracks is that they roll absolutely beautifully. Of course, you're not going to be able to make it radio controlled because the sprocket is cast resin, and obviously that's materials less than ideal for a radio controlled or a operational type format. However, back during this era here, RC tanks and 1/6 scale weren't really that prevalent as you see nowadays, where every Tom, Dick, and Harry can 3D print their own components. But again, we're talking about the lens frame here of the 2011 time frame. The tracks, again, I really love them. Now, if you're watching this video and you are wondering, will these be able to work on the Dragon Sherman, the answer is no. They are not compatible with each other because the Dragon track, I believe, is slightly different in dimensions compared to the older Panzerwerk one. So that is something to keep in mind in case you encounter one of these tracks in the wild. Jumping to the rear of the model, one other thing I want to mention is that this particular build features a fully detailed lower hull panel section. I'm not going to be able to get that on video with the model fully completed. However, this is thoroughly discussed in the other previous project update videos of this model that were posted all those years ago. As for the rear detailing here, you're looking at a product of its era. All the components that you see here are all made either out of cast resin or sheet metal. The sheet metal components would include the deflector grill, which is still listed on the catalog. However, this is going to be replaced with a 3D printed counterpart, and I am not going to be making this in metal ever again. I just don't have the time for that. So all the components you see here are individually cut, bent, and shaped to size, and then everything is soldered together, giving you the look that we have here. Just like I mentioned on a few of these other M4A3s, this whole grill can pivot out of the way so that a maintenance person can get to the inside portion over here, such as the engine hatch, as well as also to the exhaust manifolds. As you can see, the piece tucks up into the hull. If I can get it just right, there we go, in this type of a manner. If anyone have watched the other walk around video that I've done on a real M4A3 Sherman tank, I go over this in a little bit more detail. But here you get to see what the piece looks like in operation. The resin side panels over here are still in production and are still made out of cast resin. The only change is going to be the center portion here, which is going to be switched over from sheet metal to 3D print. Also, one other thing to mention is that if you are working on the Dragon M4A3, you are missing this entire section of detailing right here, which are the bulkheads, which run from this plate all the way to the rear of the hull, and also the protecting wing. So this is something to keep in mind, which again is why I still offer this set in cast resin today. With the camera off the tripod, you can see some of the other details in this area over here, relatively uninhibited by the grill work. We have the engine hatch, the M4A3 exhaust manifolds, which are all currently on the ECA catalog. The engine hatch is something I do want to phase out, and this is something that's probably going to happen within the year or so. On this area here, we can see the tow hitch assembly with the tow hitch, which is a fully functional piece on this model. This is the older cast resin unit. This has been retired a number of years ago and is no longer in production. There is a 3D printed counterpart which looks identical to this one here, and unlike this one, comes in one complete piece that is functional, unlike this multi-piece assembly that was required for this one. The extender here is still in production and isn't going to be going anywhere anytime soon. On the topic of old cast resin pieces that are still doing the job, here we have the rear idler mounts. The Vvss rear idler mounts that you see on this unit here are still in production and using the same molds that produce these ones here. It's one of those things where if it ain't broke, don't fix it, and currently I have no plans on phasing it out. Perhaps sometime in the future this will be phased out, but until then, the old resin ones are still plenty suffice for the job at hand. The unit does have an adjustable idler system, so you can adjust the track tension to where you deem fit. Of course, this is not an adjustable thing where you can adjust it on the fly. It's one of those things where you set it during the course of construction or towards the end when you have the track ready to go. You super glue or epoxy the units in place at the appropriate tension, and then once the unit sets, your tension is going to be permanently adjusted. On the opposite side takes to the bow of the model, and this is where you really start seeing the jumbo aspects coming out, and it really makes it different compared to a standard M4A3. The biggest elephant in the room here is the transmission cover. The jumbo utilized a gigantically thick front transmission cover as opposed to the one found on a standard Sherman. The transmission cover here was scratch built by hand sculpting this unit with lots of two-part epoxy. The epoxy was applied, sculpted to the appropriate shape, and then once set, I added my cast texturing to give you the final over look of it. Of course, the original rotomold model has a Sherman transmission cover molded on, and just became a skeleton for me to lump on all of the required material to thicken it up to the condition that we have here. Once the procedure was completed, however, it definitely has the look and feel of a jumbo. The remainder of the details are standard Sherman, however, like the front toe eye sections and even the little footman loops, which are welded onto the real unit. On this one here, they're just made out of pieces of bent metal and then simply glued in place, and sculpted weld beads completed the rest of the look. On the top portion, we have some more transmission cover details, namely the comb device, as well as also a tow cable clamp. These components here are fully functional, as you can see. However, the units on this one are the older cast resin units, and they have since been put out to pasture. The current 3D printed components are basically the same dimensions as these ones here. They are also still fully functional, but are also much easier to put together compared to the older cast resin counterparts. The next front detailing to mention are the bow fenders, and this is something that I still begrudgingly still produce. These are made from sheet metal and are always handmade and pressed to the shape that we have here. They are also soldered together, giving you the shape of the Sherman fender. At some point, I do want to phase these out with 3D printed counterparts, but for the time being, the cast metal ones are still listed on the catalog. One other thing that's interesting to point out is this is, again, just one of those jumbo things. Exactly how thick this transmission cover is, you really get to appreciate it when you look at the fender support found here on the Vvss mud flap. On a standard Sherman, this here is resting on the transmission cover, and you can see exactly how much armor is found on the jumbo in comparison. Obviously, they had to have these areas over here thinned out slightly just so that the fender mount can fit into place, so it could be a direct drop fit replacement for the standard transmission section. But again, you really get to appreciate just how massive the bow section is on a jumbo when you see that little bit of detailing. Moving upward takes to the front glacis plate, and this is something that is very iconic to the jumbo just because of how sparse it is of other detailing. You'll notice that we just have the bare minimum of details found in this section, such as the 1919, the Tarpon Ring, the lift hooks, and the travel lock. Absent are the other amenities such as the headlights, the siren, and the brush guards for the two corresponding units. The travel lock here is the standard Sherman pattern travel lock. This is the ECA resin version, and this one is coming to the end of its road because a 3D printed counterpart should be posted shortly after the filming of this video. But here you get to see the old school ECA one in better light. It does have the interior detailing found on the back section, and the flanges here are fully operational. as they are in the real unit, and you can actually display the unit with the tube in the travel mode. The other thing to mention for anyone who's working on a jumbo is that you just can't take a standard Sherman travel lock and secure it to the bow plate area and then call it a day. You'll notice that the two hinges here are actually sitting up on risers that bring it up to the stance that we have here. It's one of those things that are only found on the jumbo, and if you don't have it, it's going to stick out like a sore thumb. The next thing to touch upon is the 1919. This unit here is the resin cast detailing from Panzerwerk. Sadly, again, they are no longer in production. However, a good alternative would be the cast metal unit from Armor Packs. On that note, you can see here the Tarpon Ring. This was the older EastCoastArmory.com resin version. However, these were recently just replaced with a 3D printed counterpart, which you can see pictures of popping up on screen now. One other thing to mention about the jumbo is that unlike a standard Sherman where you see a visible welded plug in this area over here, that detailing is not visibly seen on the jumbo because, well, there's a gigantic steel plate added over the standard Sherman armor that's found beneath. Rest assured, that plug detailing is still there, only it's underneath the giant slab of steel that we have in this format. This is, again, only seen on the jumbo. If you're doing a standard M4A3, you got to have that ring over there with that little weld bead present. Of course, on this section over here, these two areas of the armor steel are hogged out just so that the pivoting of the bow MG is uninhibited. Of course, the armor on the jumbo doesn't just stop on the front armor plate, but also continues here on the side panels. The jumbo side armor sections are actually divvied up into two sections with this noticeable weld bead running right down this portion right over here. Of course, this is present on the opposite side, and on the model here, these were fabricated by adding panels to the side of the tank, much along the lines that was done on the real unit. Although the panels were added to the sides, the Fender Rail was still present, and you can see it's fabricated much along the same ways as I've touched upon in many of my other 1/6L Sherman videos. This one here, it's made out of a plastic strip, cut to the appropriate shape and size, and the holes were added along with the spot welds, which are seen on the real Sherman. Real Sherman tanks, these sections here are not just continuously welded, but they are welded on in spot weld type sections. Back to the rear takes us to the other rear mud flap sections, which are made out of bent pieces of sheet metal with the 3 appropriate holes drilled in place. Of course, as I often mention, they do not go all the way to the edge here of the armor plate, because on this side here we have the Little Joe auxiliary generator exhaust, which is present on this model. The exhaust manifold itself is made from a brass tube that was bent to the appropriate shape and then fitted in place. It's going to be really difficult to see in this lighting over here, but if I adjust the camera, the detailing should come out in better light. Of course, there is this little plate found in this area over here that protects the Little Joe from any sort of particulate that can get kept up by the tracks. As for the mud flap mount found on the opposite side, it too has that little gap found in this section over here, but unlike the one on the left-hand side, there is no auxiliary generator exhaust or any other type of details or fittings found in this section over here. It just stops short in space and basically is just one of those quirks found on Sherman tanks. As for the remainder of the rear detailing, this is as old school ECA as you're going to get. Here we have the spare track racks. These are made from cast resin, and you can see are fully functional and hold the Panzerwerk tracks in place absolutely perfectly. These have been retired with a set that are 3D printed, which basically are improved versions of the old school resin ones that we have here. The 3D printed ones have the weld beads integrally printed on. They have the correct type of butterfly wing nut type security mechanism, and the units can hinge open much along the lines as the old ones that we have here were able to do. The difference is with the material. One of the reasons why I phased these out was because the small little hinges that are found on these sections over here are so fragile that they can break very, very easily. The 3D printed ones are much more durable in this respect, and it's because of that why, again, I wanted to replace these old school resin ones at my earliest convenience. The 3D printed ones, of course, are listed on the ECA catalog, along with all the other components that I'm going to be mentioning in this video. And while on the topic of old retro items, here we got the rear storage rack. Of course, the M4A3 Sherman is very distinctive with this collapsing rear rack, where it can fold in this manner and also can be pivoted and hinged upward. And yes, the rack serves double duty with the mounts for the gun cleaning staves. All of the components you see here were one time offered on the ECA catalog and are long since retired. This unit here was replaced with a 3D printed counterpart. This one here is all made from sheet metal, and it is all cut, bent, stamped, soldered together by hand. And the amount of time it required to produce one of these pieces is just not something I have the ability to do anymore. So the 3D printed one was actually based off of the templates that I used to create this one here. The paper templates that were used to cut the metal out and bend it to shape were used to craft the 3D printed one. And I'm really looking forward to my next 1/6 Sherman build where I get to finally utilize that component. Also, the staves here are made from real wooden rods. We have the swab concealed in this section over here, and the end connectors on this one were made out of brass and thread together. These two were phased out with a 3D printed set where the wood obviously is still wood, I'm not going to change that, but the stave sections themselves, the fittings, those are now 3D print, as is the swab, and the swab is actually far more accurate compared to the one found in this older example here, where we have things like the pull ring as well as even the individual bristles themselves. So again, I really am looking forward to my next generation 1/6 Sherman so I could finally get to implement all these really cool new features. But for this older time capsule piece over here, obviously nothing's going to be changed, and I'm just going to appreciate this one for what it is. On a similar note, here we have the rear taillights along with the rear taillight brush guards. These two have been replaced with 3D printed counterparts. On the 3D printed ones, the lenses are made from a translucent type material, which gives you a very realistic look to them once fully painted and completed. And also the housings themselves are hollow, so you can fit in a LED to actually make them function. Oddly enough, I should say those two features were present on these older examples over here, where the units were made in a hollow format. And this one, the caps are actually opaque resin, but there was a time where I was actually casting these out of clear resin. So the new ones basically just took the baton from this one and carried it further, because the new ones do have better detailing on them in certain areas on the face and other aspects that you can do in 3D print, but you can't really do so much in standard cast resin. As for the brush guard, again, these ones here are metal, and these two have been replaced a number of years ago with the current ones, which are print. Of course, needless to say, the light on the right-hand side is the blackout light and is painted and replicated as such. Moving to the engine deck, here we have the Pioneer tools. These are actually still listed on the ECA catalog. However, I do have 3D printed counterparts on the horizon. The CAD files are done. I just got to figure out one or two things to add, and this old set can finally be put out to pasture. But here you can see what they look like in their old original format. All of the pieces are made out of cast resin that are not wood, and for the longest period of time did the job very, very well. On the side here we have another tow cable clamp. Obviously this one would secure the cable in the rear portion. I already talked about the one on the front. We have the rear lift hooks. These are still in production, as are the ones on the front and the ones on the turret for that matter, as are the hatch stops. One of those things, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Carrying further on that topic, we have the tow cable cleats. These two are cast resin items, and I don't really see myself phasing them out in the near future. Possibly some point down the road, but for now, the old ones are the best ones. Same can be said with the fire extinguisher mount. Although this piece is probably starting to show its age, I can probably make do with an update, but for the foreseeable time, it's going to stay in this format. But, you know, this is definitely something that's going to be subject to change. One thing that was phased out, however, are the ID caps, or I should say the ID plates. The fluid ID plates are now 3D print, and these old school cast resin ones have been retired for quite a while. But you can see exactly how I was able to figure out the size and detailing on these components here from the old school example. Just like with all of my Sherman builds, these units are fully functional, and these were all done by hand. This was never something I offered on the site for sale. The fuel cap was made from turned aluminum, the little handle was made from a metal wire, and the fuel filler caps here were made from cast resin that I would then modify into the functional format that we have here. Yeah, I'm probably going to be retooling those at some point, but again, we'll see when I get to another Sherman. On that note, here we have the rear engine grills, and this was one of those things I really wanted to replace, and it was actually one of the first items I made in 3D print. The grill work on the Sherman was always one of the hardest things to fabricate because everyone who releases it as a kit makes this a mistake on their models. Basically, if you look at all the other models on the market, these little slats here are big open rectangles, and the 3 bars that go across are these 3 like columns that you generally see on models. Fortunately, on a real Sherman tank, that's just not the case. The grills are actually wide little slats that are welded vertically in this type of format, and then the what would be bars running across are actually weld beads. On the model here, this was done by physically hand fitting each one of these blades in place, which were made from brass stock, and then soldering them all together to a brass rod, giving you the look that we have here. These were fortunately phased out about 2014, 2015 or so, and I am so glad I did, because the newer ones are just so much easier to assemble and are way more durable. On that note, the pieces are still fully functional, and they do have their interior detailing with the air duct found in this section over here. The air duct is made from sheet metal that was bent and soldered to shape, and this one also has the bulkheads found in this area over here, which gives it a little bit more rigidity. Of course, these details are found on the real unit. They also add a hell of a lot of weight to it too, by the way. Moving back, we got the rear blower. This is a cast resin ECA piece, and it's still in production. Again, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. As for the bow details, again, some of these parts have been phased out, others are still in production and are listed on the catalog. The blower over here is still in production. In fact, I just processed one for an order at the time of filming of this video, but I do want to phase it out with a printed one, probably within the next couple weeks or so. The backup periscopes, these are the cast resin ones. These have been retired and put out the pasture with a printed counterpart. On the hatches themselves, these hatches are still in production, but the Periscope insert and the brush guards are not. The brush guards on this model here are all made from hand-bent pieces of brass rod that were bent to shape and soldered, and it was a hallmark set that used to be offered on the ECA catalog. In recent years, these have been phased out with 3D printed ones in both standard material, HD material, and yes, I now offer these pieces in metal 3D print, which are made from brass, much along the lines as these old ones that we have here. So it's kind of funny how they went full circle. These hatches are fully functional. You open up and reveals the detailing on the inside. The Periscope insert that we have here is from Panzerwerk. It was a cast resin set, and these were absolutely gorgeous. These are sadly no longer in production from Panzerwerk. However, a alternative set would be the ones from Armor Packs, which are basically the exact same quality, only are made out of cast metal as opposed to the cast resin used on these older counterparts. One other thing to mention is that on the ECA catalog, there are 2 options for bow hatches. The one that we have here was specifically designed back in the mid-2000s for use on the James DeSimone rotomold Sherman tanks, which of course this one's based off of. After the Dragon Sherman tank came out, I went ahead and tooled up a set of bow hatches that are specifically designed for the Dragon M4A3 Sherman, and there is a difference in the size of the hatch compared between the 2 counterparts. So if you're building the Dragon M4A3, that hatch is listed on the catalog, and it is well listed as such. But again, it's one of those things I do want to mention. Moving upward takes us to the Turd, as well as the main 76mm. The tube that we have here was hand turned out of PVC, bringing it for the shape. I actually do have a replacement 76mm that is found on the ECA catalog, and it is a 3D printing. On the mantlet, this is something that is handmade, and it's actually one of the cooler aspects on the Jumbo, and specifically on this example here. The Jumbo mantlet is actually a mix of the standard 76mm mantlet from the T23 Turd. However, when they incorporated it in the Jumbo, they modified it quite extensively. So basically what you'll see is 2 units that we have here. This unit from the weld bead back is the standard 76mm T23 cast mantlet, and you can see how it's round and it's got the cast texturing to it, along with those 2 lift lugs found on either section. However, when they modified it for Jumbo, they lobbed off the little nose that sticks out for the 76mm, and they welded on a gigantic slab of steel in this area over here. And you can see that weld bead running along this section, and runs along the entire location of where these 2 sections would meet on the real model, or I should say on the real vehicle, that is. The plate, like I said before, is just rolled slab steel, so you will see a difference in texturing between the two counterparts. And unlike the T23 unit, where everything is nice and round, you'll see on the Jumbo, it's a little bit more brutalistic, where it's just angular on all these facets. These giant angle cuts found on either side here of the lower cheek sections were done so it could clear the hatches so they could open up with the turret amidships. And also, you can see the Americans weren't screwing around with the nose section that protects the barrel, where it is a gigantic just mound of steel and is just welded in place. On this section over here, you'll see the muzzle section of a MG pointing out. This is a M2HB. Now, originally when the Jumbos were armed with the 75mm, they utilized a standard M1919, and you would see no provision sticking out because obviously it would be, the 1919 ends around here when fitted to the internal mounts. However, shortly after the vehicles were upgraded with the 76, it was also ordered that they would be rearmed with M2HBs. Luckily, with the way the receivers are on the M2 and with the 1919, they're relatively the same size, so adapting a Browning 50 to fit into this section over here took practically no work, and it was done to a multitude of vehicles, even ones that weren't 76mm Jumbos. It's one of those contentious things that everyone always gets confused by when they see a picture of a real Sherman tank, specifically ones in action, and they see the barrel sticking out. A lot of people think it's a 1919 or it's a 30, and that's how it's supposed to be on all Sherman tanks, but that is definitely not the case. On a standard Sherman, the 1919 barely sticks out of the standard 75mm mantlet, and on a 76 it's basically flush because of the thickness of the armor. But if you're doing a Jumbo with the 50, it is going to protrude out in this type of format, and it's one of those things that really seals the deal, making this a 76 armed M4A3E2. As for the actual mantlet, this is 100% scratch built. In the years that followed this build, I actually developed a T23 cast resin mantlet. However, for this one here, that wasn't in existence, so it had to have been done the old-fashioned way. The unit itself is actually fabricated out of planks of wood that were fastened into a box-type structure, and then fiberglass resin and epoxies were applied to the surfaces to give it the look that we have here. The next thing to mention, of course, is the turret, and before anyone puts in the comment section, no, this is not a revised or retooled T23 turret. This turret here was 100% Jumbo. The one on the model here is 100% scratch built, which I've touched upon earlier, but basically this turret here had nothing in common with the standard T23 outside of the trunnion, which was again used to adapt a standard T23 but give it extra armor. The turret itself is its own animal. You'll note it doesn't have the shell ejection port found on this side of the turret because they needed it just to give it as much armor protection as possible. This turret is almost, I believe, double the weight as it is on the standard T23 76mm. Also, with the way the roof is, you can see how the casting was done, and then they sealed it off by taking a plate and just welding it in this section over here. As for why the two turrets have a similar appearance to themselves, well, one had to do with the shape of the trunnion, but the other was because this was basically the shape of contemporary American turret designs of the period. You compare this with vehicles like the Pershing or even the Jackson for that matter, they're really starting to take this type of a shape. And since the T23 turret works so well mating to the Sherman, they basically use that as a basis to concoct the heavy Sherman turret that we have here for the Jumbo. On the Jumbo, you can see, again, one of the differences between that and a standard T23 is just how thick this section is over here. I love how they have to scallop this area over here in order to put the trunnion pin in place. You compare that with a T23 where it's basically a smooth transition from this area. But again, you know, welcome to Jumbo. Moving rearward takes us to the rear blower, the 50 cal storage pintle, and also the 50 cal storage racks. The pintle is still in production and is going to be for quite some time. The fan blower on this one is a scratch-built example. However, in the years that came after, I actually tooled this up in standard cast resin, and I don't see myself replacing that anytime soon. The piece is hollow underneath, as it is, of course, on the real one, because this is actually where the blower is, and it vents out the fumes from the main gun. On the 50 cal storage racks. However, this is something that has been recently phased out. The ones on this model here are made out of cast resin, and the clips are made out of sheet metal, as is the receiver clamp. On the new counterpart, these have all been replaced with components made from 3D printings from one various material to the other. The rails are made from a standard white nylon, while the clamps and the other detail components are made from HD materials. Moving to the turret roof takes us to the last bits of detailing. I already touched upon the Periscope Guard before, how this one's brass and the newer ones are 3D print. But here you get to see what old school ECA components look like once fitted to the model. Here we have the gunner's periscope box over here, and this, by the way, is still in production. No need to phase it out at the time. The vane sight, however, this was the old school Wrestler one, and this has been replaced with an HD 3D printed component. The searchlight here is still in production. Only the difference is the lens on this one is made from clear resin, while the newer ones are HD 3D print and they're translucent. The cover cap is chain retained as it is on the real unit, and that is still true. The 50 cal travel lock is functional on this model over here, and this is the older Wrestler one. This has been phased out with ones made in 3D print. The Commander's late production cupola, this is still in production. This piece here, it's still in the exact same condition as it was back when I released them all those years ago. It has the internal periscope details and also the inner ring details over here. The one piece that is not supplied with the ECA set, of course, is the periscope, because for the longest period of time, this was intended for you to utilize the Panzerwerk inner periscope detailing, because that came in a set, and you can simply just modify it to fit on the ECA piece. However, in current year, obviously you're going to have to use the Armor Packs one for that unit, or until I finally eventually tool up my own periscope, or just straight up replace this component altogether with a 3D printed one, which may or may not be coming down the road. We'll see when I start on my Armortech M4A3E2. Hint, hint. Carry on takes us to the loader's hatch. This is the old school cast resin component from ECA. This set here has been retired, and in its place I have a 3D printed counterpart. And in addition to the 3D print one, I have another version which is specifically designed for the Armortech M4A3E2, because that hatch is slightly different in size compared to the one found on the Jumbo. Oddly enough, this one here I tooled up back in 2005, or yeah, around 2007, 5 or 7 or so, and in 2012, when the Dragon Sherman came out, I had to develop one specifically for the Dragon Sherman because the Dragon hatch is smaller than the old school ECA one. Fast forward a little bit further, when the Armortech kit one comes out, I had to design one specifically for the Armortech because the one I developed for the Dragon Sherman is too small to fit on the Armortech. And the Armortech hatch is basically almost the exact same size as the one found on my first generation of cast resin hatches. But that's a little in-depth, but there you go. Both the Dragon pattern and the Armortech pattern of 3D printed hatches are found on the ECA catalog. They supply you with all the detailing that we have here. Obviously, I wanted to just build upon this set here. We have real springs, as they are on the new ones. And unlike this one, though, the new one, the lever is actually fully functional, and the pad here is a real rubber pad. So I'm, again, taking advantage of the advancements in production, specifically with modern technology. Moving along takes us to the turret-mounted M2HB. Of course, this being an American tank, it is law. You have to have an M2HB on any American tank, and the Jumbo here is no exception. The pedestal base that we have here is the old school cast resin ECA one. It's got the little cover cap for when the M2 isn't fitted in place, and this has been phased out with a 3D printed counterpart. And what's cool about the 3D printed counterpart is that it retains all the functionality as this one over here, with the way it can pivot and fold out of the way if you take off the fasteners. But the cover cap is actually made out of a real piece of rubber as opposed to resin found on the older counterpart here. On the M2, this is the Dragon M2HB, which was at one point sold as a kit, and back in 2011 they were very prolific, very affordable too. And this is still, by far, in my opinion, the finest example of an M2HB in 1/6 scale. The piece is extremely detailed. It is excellent. It's basically the best option out there. Unfortunately, Dragon no longer produces this set in either kit form or as a fully produced piece. However, that's not the end of the Dragon M2, because ZY Toys went ahead and basically made a carbon copy of the Dragon tooling. It is excellent with the type of detailing found on that set. You're going to find the same exact details, the same quality of details, and it is a worthy addition to add to your American tank. So if you're looking for an M2 HB, get the CY toy ones, and you're not going to be disappointed. As for mounting the M2, of course, you need some kind of a cradle type setup, and this one here I use the M23 cradle, which was by far the most common cradle found on World War II American vehicles, and this one here is a white metal set from Armor Packs. This set here is still in production, and they are excellent. If you're looking for an M23 cradle, the Armor Packs is the way to go. If you're looking for other alternative solutions for mounting a cradle to your M2, ECA has 3D printed cradles, but are a different flavor compared to the standard M23. So that is something to keep in mind, specifically if you're looking to add a little bit of extra spice in your collection, you want to differentiate it by adding a different type of cradle or two. Of course, the next thing that is law to put on your American World War II pattern tank is a MP48 spring antenna base. And this one here is the unit from EastCoastArmory.com, and yes, it is still fully functional with the real spring and all. It's actually my favorite component to add on these models, and it's actually one of the items that built the ECA catalog from day one. It was literally one of the first items I ever offered. And so I have a, special soft spot for the MP48. This one here is made out of cast resin, as they are currently on the ECA catalog. Perhaps at some point down the road, I may phase them out when the molds wear out, but this remains to be seen. The knurled tips are present, as is the antenna wire, of course, and it just has a oh-so-satisfying little bend to it when you flex them. Of course, the MP48 is painted in a certain way where the rib section is painted to look like a porcelain type coloring. My personal go-to is Tamiya Hull Red, and then you paint a little bit of gloss on it to give that nice little glaze sheen. It's amazing still how many people screw this up on their builds. It's baffling how many people overlook this little bit of detailing that's just right there for the taking. But again, hopefully if anyone's watching this video and you are working on your American tank, you should definitely revise them if you don't already do this little feature here. As for the knurled tips, this is another bit of detailing that's commonly overlooked. There's blue on the bottom, red on top. And these antennas do come in different colors, but as for the colors and where they're used, this is something that's really outside of my expertise, but I'm pretty sure there's some documentation out there that can point otherwise. From what I've seen, the bottoms are usually blue and the tops are red. But again, if anyone knows a little bit more in depth, feel free to put that in the comment section below. Regardless, you do need to paint the knurled tips some color on your builds in order to further enhance them. And here's the model in the display area, which is by far a huge improvement compared to its last location, which was tucked away, forgotten about, in an enclave in the shop. Of course, Leo over here is in fantastic company because right next to it I have the Armortech M4A4 Sherman. And of course, in the background we have some more 135s and smaller scale builds that have been seen on the channel, and that pile just keeps getting bigger and bigger. We have a bunch of RC 116s, and directly behind it we have some more of my 1/6 scale builds. Of course, all of these models that you see here have been discussed thoroughly in their own respective model showcase videos. Also at this time, I want to congratulate the keen-eyed amongst you because yes, that is a real Sherman tank track link right there on the floor in front of these two models, and that is something I have used as a prop from time to time on the various smaller scale model showcase videos that have been posted on the channel, and it will continue to be used as such as time goes on. But of course, more information on that is to come in other model showcase videos. And with that, that wraps up this model update video for the 1/6 scale M4A3E2 76mm Sherman tank. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel where it's a great way to keep up to date on new posted content, being large scale content like this video over here, or the other smaller scale content that frequently gets posted to this channel. Another way to keep in loop of new posted content is by liking us on Facebook. There, I have more photographs of this particular model, as well as the other smaller and larger scale builds that have been seen on this channel in the past. Furthermore, don't forget to swing by EastCoastArmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detail components. Thanks again, and I'll be seeing you all again on the next one. Until then.